Welcome to the third session of Live and Learn. Our topic this evening is IVF pro-life? US President Donald Trump, when he was announcing going to decrease costs for this and he had a plan, he said, you can't get more pro-life than this. And US Senator Josh Hawley also said, as a pro-life guy, I think that IVF is pro-life. It helps people start their family or add to their family if they want to. US Senators Ted Cruz and Katie Britt wrote an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal titled "We'll Protect Both Life and IVF." I apologize for all of these American references. That's just because there are a lot more pro-life politicians in the States who have public comments on IVF. Also, campaign manager Kellyanne Conway, she has a consulting group and she polled pro-lifers and found that 78% of pro-lifers support IVF. So if you're only looking at these quotations, public polling, you might think that IVF is pro-life, which is why we pose the question, is IVF pro-life? But I'm about to show you a video from Choice for Two, which is really short, but I think it's very effective at exposing what IVF is really about. And then I think we can properly answer this question.
Welcome to Build a Baby, where anyone who wants a baby can build one. Something broken? Missing an ingredient or two? In our state-of-the-art facility, using state-of-the-art technology, we can build your state-of-the-art baby. Starting with the swimmers. If you've got a sperm producer, you'll be quite comfortable in our semen collection room, where you'll find everything you need to perform the task at hand. No sperm producer? No problem. Build your baby with our extensive donor sperm bank, where all our donors meet the highest human standards. Now, on to the eggs. As with the sperm, if you're missing an egg carrier, you'll have full access to our egg donation bank, all gathered from top specimens. But if you do have an egg carrier, we'll pump that sucker full of hormones, so you can get as many eggs as possible in the shortest amount of time.
And then the true magic begins. Building a baby in a petri dish. Truly a miracle.
All embryos will be graded, and we'll discard any defective or genetically imperfect babies before you even know it. Building a baby shouldn't make you feel guilty. Congratulations! You're the proud parents of multiple embryos. Now all that's left is the womb. Are you a womb carrier? Get ready to party. No womb? No worries. Our womb rental managers will find the perfect match for your baby building. At long last, the day has come. Embryo transfer day. Cross your fingers that an embryo will stick, and you'll get that one perfect baby. Or two, or three, or 8. Not to worry, selective reduction will take care of that. Wondering what happens to your Build-A-Babies that we don't transfer? For a small fee, we'll store them in our top-of-the-line cryogenic freezers, ready for you to try again, or discard, or donate, or give to science. A beautiful gift. But whatever happens, Build-A-Baby is happy to help you again, and again, and again, no matter the cost. Contact us and build your baby today.
Just to summarize how it works, in order to achieve fertilization, you need an egg and you need sperm. So to retrieve an egg, women are pumped with hormones to stimulate the ovaries to encourage the maturation of multiple eggs, because this can be a very expensive procedure. It doesn't have super high success rates. They want multiple eggs from one cycle, which are extracted with a needle and a suction device, or an egg is donated. The man provides a semen sample, or the sperm is donated or ordered from a sperm bank. And then to achieve fertilization, the sperm is either injected directly into the eggs or just mixed with eggs in a petri dish. And then the uterus is prepped again with hormones. This can be very hard a woman's body, and the embryos, whether fresh or frozen, are then injected into the uterus. And if multiple embryos then successfully implant in the uterus, one or more may be aborted, either to increase the odds that at least one child is born successfully, or to help the mother have a healthy pregnancy. Obviously, though, when you're talking about selective reduction, you're talking about killing a baby in the womb. So it wasn't enough that, again, IVF itself might result in some embryos being killed, but also, again, we're talking about abortion here, also gets potentially introduced into this process. And so what happens with the remaining embryos? Because, again, multiple eggs are matured, you create multiple embryos. Not all of those embryos are actually injected into the uterus. And so the remaining ones are left frozen or discarded. They may be donated or used for research. So this was a recent post on X from Live Action, and they say that for every one baby born via IVF, there is an average of 15 siblings. Parents don't plan to have that many babies, so they are frozen indefinitely, experimented on, or destroyed. They pay the price for one sibling with their lives. This is the horrific reality of the IVF industry. So I'm not sure what the source of that stat is for Live Action, but it is very similar to data from 2012 that came from the UK, which suggests that just 7% of embryos are actually implanted, and that 93% of them are never used. And they say for 15 embryos are made for every woman conceiving through in vitro fertilization. Almost half are discarded during or after the process. So again, extremely low percentages, and that's 7% are implanted. That doesn't mean that it actually leads to a live birth. That percentage could even be lower. The Heritage Foundation in the United States wrote in 2024 that only 2.3% of all embryos created in the United States result in the live birth of a baby. That's based on their estimate using CDC figures. And they say 1 million embryos are frozen in liquid nitrogen. And by other sources, it's actually 1.5 million are frozen in liquid nitrogen. So when we ask the question, is IVF pro-life? We have to look at the percentages, which is that a whole lot of embryos are actually dying or being killed in the process of trying to get this live birth of a baby. So I'm referring to a lot to US figures and stats because we don't have a lot of good information in Canada. However, the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society did put out a report, and they looked at 36 clinics. So it's not necessarily comprehensive. They found of those 36 clinics, 21,697 retrievals occurred. And again, they're retrieving multiple eggs at the same time. And of these eggs, they got 103,949 utilizable embryos. Only a fraction of those embryos were actually transferred into a uterus, 27,682. And of those, again, only some actually took, successfully implanted, and resulted in either an ongoing pregnancy or a live birth. But I really want to highlight here that's 103,949 utilizable embryos. So what do they mean by utilizable? Also in the report, they have utilizable embryo rate, and just over half of the embryos created were considered utilizable. So that doesn't mean that, you know, the other embryos weren't human beings. It just means that they didn't think that the chances of implantation were as high, or the chances of a successful live birth were as high. But these are human beings which are still being created here and are still deserving of having their dignity recognized and respected. And they still have human rights, even if their chances of long-term survival might not be as high based on some scientists' opinion. So again, we're seeing a huge rate here of human beings who are not actually getting the opportunity to be born and to enjoy life as we do. So the sad reality is that the baby making industry is also involved in baby killing, paradoxically. And as a pro-life movement, we have a really hard time trying to convince fellow Canadians that the baby killing industry, the abortion industry, is actually killing babies. So many people want to deny that abortion kills innocent human beings. They want to live in ignorance about it. They deny that the unborn are human, even though that's the very purpose of abortion, is to kill a human being. If you don't end up with a dead embryo or fetus at the end of the procedure, the abortion is unsuccessful. It has failed. And so if we have a hard time trying to convince people that abortion kills innocent human beings, that the baby killing industry is killing babies, how much more difficult will it be to help people understand that the baby making industry is also involved in baby killing? So I think this is why you see a lot of pro-lifers supporting IVF, is because of ignorance. They're just simply not aware of it. And so this makes, I think, opposing IVF even harder for us. In fact, the baby making industry might be more prolific at baby killing than the baby killing industry, because typically the baby killing industry is killing, maybe 1, 2 babies for a pregnant woman who enters an abortion facility. But with IVF, as you saw, you could be killing a dozen embryos in one go, easy peasy. And the problem is only going to get worse. 2% of babies being born in Canada and the US today are being conceived via IVF, and that number has doubled since 2010 in Canada, and in certain provinces it's higher. So in Ontario, it's actually 3% of babies being born were conceived via IVF. And nearly every province, with the exception of Alberta and with the exception of the territories of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, nearly every province provides some level of subsidization for IVF, including Saskatchewan under pro-life Premier Scott Moe. That's one of the things that he said when he was trying to get reelected. So again, this speaks to, I think, the ignorance that a lot of pro-lifers are operating with. We really need to make it clear that pro-life is not just about celebrating babies being born, even though it is that. We want people to have kids, but more importantly, we don't want them to kill children. It's not just about making babies, it's about not killing babies. And so because of this level of subsidization, again, you see that more and more couples are pursuing this option because it is more affordable to them. Just a few days ago, Costco in the United States indicated that it would try to cut IVF drug costs so that IVF drugs could be cheaper for its members. The World Health Organization says that 1 in 6 people experience infertility, and reproductive problems in men and miscarriages in women are increasing by 1% per year, which might not sound a lot, except when you think year after year after year. If this increase continues at the same rate, that is a huge problem. And so as more people experience infertility, more people are going to be turning to IVF and more embryos will die. The Canadian fertility service market is estimated or projected to be worth $2.8 billion in 2030. So that's not exclusively IVF, but it does include IVF. And I've been, providing a lot of statistics, shooting a lot of numbers at you. And so it's easy just to think about it like theoretically and just to think of embryos as clumps of cells, but we have to take it from the abstract and think about them as real human beings. So Josh Wood is the executive director of an organization called Them Before Us, which I'll talk about momentarily, but he compiled a bunch of posts from people who have gone through IVF. So in their own words, whether it's on Reddit or somewhere else, this is what they had to say. One person said, "I think about them every day," referring to their frozen embryos. Someone else, I'm not going to read the whole thing, said, "I struggle with this whenever I look at my son, who is the result of a successful frozen embryo transfer. I'm also pro-choice and initially had no problem checking the donate to science box. I have 2 on ice and am pregnant with twins after another successful embryo transfer. So if this carries to term, it is highly likely we will not have more kids." Goes on to say, Somehow seeing it become so real with my son changed how I felt about those little clumps of cells. And then concludes by saying, I don't know, trying to tell myself nothing is certain and they are truly clumps of cells. Maybe I'll just pay for storage forever and make my kids pull the plug when I die. Think about how perverse that is, that you don't want the burden of figuring out what to do with the two children that you've left on ice. And so when you pass away, you're going to transfer that burden to their siblings and say, it's up to you whether you want to continue to pay for storage or if you're just going to discard your very own siblings who are not as lucky as you to have been implanted. But these are the very real decisions that people are being confronted with. Someone else asked, what do you do when you're told by your partner to destroy the remaining embryos as they can't go through it again and you're left bereft? How do you come to terms with the loss? We have a beautiful child from second try of IVF. Someone else just says, I can't afford to think like this. I have 16 frozen embryos. Definitely can't have 16 kids. Someone else said they had a successful IVF journey, gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I thought it'd be done after one child, but now I keep thinking about my 2 frozen embryos left at the lab. I really feel a deep sorrow knowing that my girl once was one of those embryos and she got a chance. Now she's here and she's so perfect. What about my other potentially perfect babies? Yes, I'm thinking about them as babies and not just fertilized eggs. Every night, I'm wondering what they would look like and how they deserve a life because they're my children and they should be loved. I really don't want more children because having one is so overwhelming and I'm basically alone and isolated with a husband who's always away for work. He's in the army. Am I crazy? Acknowledges they should be loved. And it's stunning how much clarity you get after the fact. Someone else says, wife and I are both vehemently pro-choice. We have 2 kids and are probably only equipped to care for 2 kids. We still have 2 embryos on ice. Our IVF conceived daughter is amazing. It makes me think about how the clinic chose her. And if they'd chosen a different embryo, we'd have a totally different kid. And this kid would still be frozen. The thought of never meeting this kid breaks my heart. She's incredible. And it really does come down sometimes to chance. So this person says, I feel a certain grief that we won't get to know who those other 2 embryos might have become. But I'd rather have fewer kids and regret the possibility lost than have more kids than we can do right by. The very cold and clinical calculations that are being made. Someone else again mentions that they're pro-choice, but the fact that these guys exist and are ours really stops me in my tracks. I look at my beautiful son and wonder if the embryos are like him. Of course, they could be completely the opposite and be unable to progress for myriad reasons. Just mentions that, pregnancy is hard, might need counseling to decide what to do. Someone else, we have 2 perfect kids from IVF and signed the rest of ours over to genetic testing a couple months after the second was born. I had 16 unused embryos. There is no world where I have 18 kids. I just wanted to, but I still cried when I signed the paperwork in front of the notary. It was still a lot, and I still think about the babies and kids and people that those embryos could have become. And again, this is just like, I didn't include every post on this thread, and this thread doesn't include every post that people shared. And these are just people who posted about the experience, and other people are going to their counselors about it or writing in their own diaries or something like that. These are very real human beings, which makes this even more disturbing, which is that one company decided to answer the question of what to do with frozen embryos by turning these embryos into jewelry. They mentioned transforming these embryos into timeless pieces that can be cherished forever. Each embryo is treated with the utmost care, dignity, and respect by our experienced team of artisans. Through advanced techniques, we encapsulate the essence of life in stunning, handcrafted jewelry designed to last for generations. This is something that psychopaths do. That's not to say that the couples who pursue this aren't trying to do right by their children, but the idea of killing a human being and then trying to keep their remains with you forever, again, that's something you would watch on Criminal Minds or a show like that. And again, we're so detached from it. I think there's some recognition here that these children are precious, and that's why you have people trying to preserve them somehow instead of just discarding them. But again, the idea that these human beings were killed is, I think there's great cognitive dissonance here, and that people are valuing what these embryos could become, but not actually necessarily recognizing that these embryos deserve that dignity, care, and respect from the beginning. So what really can be done with surplus embryos? This is a really complex ethical question, which I'm not going to be able to respond to now. I will mention the idea of snowflake embryo adoption, and they're referred to as like snowflake babies. The embryos are donated to a different couple who birthed that child instead. And the snowflake element is really supposed to emphasize how unique each embryo, each human being is. So that is one possibility of what can be done with surplus embryos, but I do want to highlight it does create somewhat of a detrimental incentive in that maybe a couple who's struggling with whether or not I should do IVF, they could just say, well, maybe we'll do this and we can just donate the embryos to some other couple, despite the fact that, again, we have like 1.5 million embryos that are frozen just in the United States alone. And so I worry about this embryo adoption program as actually still incentivizing people to create even more and more embryos, and so that we end up with millions more than could possibly be adopted. But again, the question still remains, what do we do with all of these abandoned embryos? How do we care for them still? And so this is one solution that some people came up with. I want to return briefly to the pro-life syllogism. So if you've attended the Live and Learn sessions last month and the month prior, this is something we talked about with abortion and euthanasia. Our first premise is that it's wrong to kill innocent human beings. The second premise is that abortion kills innocent human beings, or euthanasia kills innocent human beings. In this case, IVF kills innocent human beings. And then we can conclude that therefore IVF is wrong. And the way the syllogism works is that if the first two premises are correct, we must accept the conclusion that IVF is wrong, just like euthanasia or just like abortion would also be wrong. However, maybe it could be argued that IVF doesn't necessarily entail the killing of innocent human beings. So abortion, euthanasia, that's the very purpose, it's the point. But is there a way to do IVF that doesn't involve killing innocent human beings? And essentially, what if no surplus embryos are created? What if for every embryo that's created, you ensure that they're implanted? Or you only create, 1 or 2 each cycle. There's a reason why that's usually not the case. Again, because the chances of implantation are not very high. They mature so many eggs and they create so many embryos so that people aren't going through these cycles repeatedly without any success. But if you were to do it this way, yes, in theory, no embryo might die. But I would point out that you're still helping to fund and grow an industry that is killing thousands of human beings. And we know that many other couples are pursuing this option who are not as considerate about it. That, IVF clinic is still, making bank either way. They can continue to advertise and they can expand their staff, etc. Maybe a good parallel would be, would you ever support Planned Parenthood? Even if it's for something they're doing like STI testing or something like that. Even if you're supporting something that could be good, could be ethical, that doesn't mean that you're not, at least indirectly helping them with all of the evil that they're doing as well. So I think it's one thing to consider this in the future if ever the creation of additional embryos was prohibited. Again, what do we do with the existing surplus embryos? But I think right now we have to think about how we're cooperating with and condoning an industry that kills thousands of human beings. And in addition to that, there are many other concerns with IVF. Just in principle, that it treats children as commodities. And so you see all sorts of abuses that stem from that. Abuses that Them Before Us is really good about highlighting, where people are literally purchasing children sometimes, people who should have no business raising children. I've been kind of talking about this and operating under the assumption that the biological parents are raising the children, but often that's not the case. And so the children might have identity issues. The children might end up with someone who is not in a position to be a parent and actually might have very, very dark intentions and abuses. Cases where like donors end up fathering hundreds of the same children, or like lab mix-ups where a couple gets the wrong baby or something like that. IVF also contributes to a higher risk of cognitive, developmental, and physical problems in children, because you can think of those embryos that are frozen and then implanted. The thawing process, not all embryos actually survive it, but then those that do, what problems are they left with? That hormone levels are not always the same as they would be through like a natural conception. So again, this can lead to things like cardiovascular problems, higher cancer rates, things like premature birth. And then eugenic considerations are also being made about which embryos to implant. So currently in Canada, you can't select for like the sex of the embryo, for instance, unless it's like related to a sex-linked disease. But in other countries, you can do so. And the science certainly has the capabilities these days. So we might be looking at a future where you could select for a child that is blonde, blue-eyed, and has a high IQ or something like that. So I think we have to really worry about what IVF can enable. But when it gets personal, how do you talk about this when it's your child who says, I'm considering doing IVF, or your neighbor tells you that they conceived through IVF? Practically, how do you talk about it? Because I went over all the stats and they might be useful, but you're not going to like spring out this PowerPoint to your niece or your nephew or your cousin or something like that. So these are just some things to keep in mind when you talk about it. I'm not going to tell you how to talk about it because I don't think there's a script for it. But one thing to keep in mind is that children are always a gift, no matter how they are conceived. So, for instance, you could be opposed to premarital sex and still think that a child conceived that way is something to be celebrated and cherished, and that pregnancy should still be supported, even if you condemn premarital sex as sinful. Same thing goes for something like adultery. Again, we can say adultery is always bad, and yet know that the children conceived through something like that are not to blame and should not be punished at all. The same thing goes for IVF. We can say IVF is bad and still be grateful for the children who are alive today, even through something like it. So that's always really important to affirm, because I think people, again, with it's 2% of people being born in Canada who are conceived through IVF, chances are high you know someone who was conceived through IVF. And I think that's why, again, people find it difficult to oppose IVF. They think, oh, so-and-so, though, wouldn't be here if it was not for IVF. Also, the desire to have children is natural and good. So with something like abortion, even if we might understand it, we can't say that, you know, that is something that we can affirm that you ended up killing your child. But conversely, with IVF, your desire to have children, to reproduce, that is completely naturally ordered. Now, the means, I don't think can be condoned. I don't think that the ends justify the means. But that inclination, that instinct, that you want to have kids really bad, that is completely natural, and that should be affirmed. And then when you can't have kids, that can be a great burden. Infertility is a great cross that some couples have to carry. And I think that recognizing that pain and not trivializing it, recognizing it as a great loss, I think is really important whenever we're having discussions about this. There are alternatives to IVF, something called restorative reproductive medicine or natural procreative technology, NAPRO technology. So with IVF, essentially you're trying to route around the infertility problem, and that you're like, we're just going to stick a baby inside you and do our best to hope that like it attaches. And again, we're going to pump you full of hormones to achieve that. And it's attempting to, again, like force it to happen instead of it happening naturally, but you're not actually dealing with the underlying problem of infertility at all. And when you do so, restorative reproductive medicine, it can actually have greater chances of success than IVF. It's a little bit more complex because you actually have to figure out what the problem is. But that's, I think, really important because whatever's causing that infertility might be causing other symptoms as well. And it could lead to greater health problems down the line. And actually correcting that can be very critical and good for that person's health and well-being overall. And then it would also allow someone to conceive naturally. And so that's really the point of medicine. It's not, again, let's come up with some like really fabricated solution to get around this problem and make you conceive anyway. It's how can we correct what is wrong so that you have the chance to reproduce. Now, it's not always going to be successful, and the other alternative here is adoption. And so these are good things that should be considered, but again, they don't necessarily relieve the problem of infertility. Infertility can still be heartbreaking. So even when you discuss these alternatives, I think it's really important to be sensitive to that struggle still. I would refer you to them before us. The whole principle of the organization is that the needs and the rights and the well-being of children come before the desires of parents. So then before us, it has a fact sheet specifically on IVF. It also deals with a number of other issues as well, all centered around this idea of how can we better prioritize children in the discussion of these ethical issues. And then our speaker at last year's National March for Life Rose Dinner was Emily Stimson Chapman. She spoke about infertility and IVF. And if you haven't watched that video on our March for Life Canada YouTube channel, I'd highly recommend doing so. So if you are having a conversation about IVF with someone, this is how I might do it. And I might start off by saying, I'm really sorry for the pain that you're experiencing through infertility. And if you can relate to that experience, great, or not great, but you can share that if you're comfortable doing so. In my case, I could only say that like, I can't imagine what it must be like to go through something like that. And I don't wish at all to take away from that pain. So I can understand why you might be considering IVF. And I want you to know that if you did go that route and you did conceive a child through IVF, that I would love that child and I think they have the same dignity as everyone else. That said, I do think that IVF is wrong and it's harmful. And when you're doing your research on this process, because all couples are going to do a lot of research on it, kind of have to, I'd encourage you to check out these resources to make sure you have a really well-rounded view of what it entails. And maybe you could also refer them to that thread of Josh Woods on X of people who went through IVF and are sharing their experiences. So you really know everything about what it entails. Be open-minded, clear eyes about what IVF involves. And I hope you'll consider that. So just kind of put it on the table as I hope you would consider learning more about these issues. And so the last thing I want to leave you with this evening is that children are a gift, but they are not a right. So we certainly aren't entitled to them. And I think there's a lot of dangers that arise when we begin to think that they are a right, and we can use any means possible to obtain them.